Story 1. The GPS led us somewhere we shouldn't be. 4 of us were compressed into my somewhat dilapidated Trailblazer sport utility vehicle that August evening. We were journeying from Manhattan, Kansas towards Chicago. Jacob continuously adjusted the frequency of the car's radio receiver, while Carlos meticulously counted the monetary funds we had gathered for fuel. Thomas was stretched out across the rear seating area, already partially in slumber despite his prior promise to remain wakeful for the entirety of the expedition. We had completed our studies at Midwest State University just 3 months prior, and I was in the process of relocating to commence my new employment at Innovate Solutions Corp., situated in the city's central business district. The gentleman insisted on undertaking the 12-hour vehicular journey alongside me. They asserted it was a long-standing custom, a final escapade before each of us pursued our individual paths. My personal belongings for the apartment occupied the trunk compartment and the majority of the cargo area. Boxes were piled so excessively high that I could barely discern objects through the rear window. We had been traversing the roadway for approximately 6 hours when Carlos began expressing a need to stretch his lower limbs. The global positioning system indicated a designated rest area approaching within 15 miles, situated somewhere between absolute desolation and complete emptiness on Highway 36. Jacob was operating the vehicle by that point, his eyes narrowed as he peered through the pervasive gloom at the deserted road ahead. Not a singular other automobile had passed our vehicle for the preceding 60 minutes. The radio persistently interchanged with disruptive static, and Thomas had ultimately ceased his endeavors to locate a satisfactory broadcasting station. It was at that precise moment that we perceived the faded cerulean sign for Riverside Rest Area, which was scarcely discernible within the illumination provided by our headlamps. Jacob maneuvered the vehicle off the main thoroughfare without any of us uttering a singular utterance. We all required a respite. We needed to ambulate, perhaps acquire a refreshment from the vending machines, if they were still operational. The rest area was precisely what one would anticipate in the central expanse of rural America. There were a pair of brick structures with inconsistently illuminating fluorescent fixtures, several picnic tables dispersed throughout the vicinity, and a parking expanse that had evidently experienced more favorable conditions. Only one other conveyance was present there, an aged, pallid panel van parked considerably distant in the periphery near the arboreal boundary. Jacob pulled the vehicle into close proximity to the principal edifice, and we all disembarked, expressing groans and performing stretching movements. The nocturnal atmosphere impacted us distinctly in that locale. It was dense and humid, replete with the melodic sounds of crickets and that characteristic earthy aroma one solely encounters far from urban environments. Carlos proceeded directly towards the public convenience facility, while Jacob commenced performing jumping jacks adjacent to the automobile. Thomas extracted his bundle of a brand of cigarettes and gestured towards the forested territory situated behind the structures. "I'm going to partake in a smoke," he articulated, already progressing away before any of us could formulate a retort. I recall verifying my mobile communication device. It was 3:47 a.m. There was no network reception. The automated vending apparatuses were ancient. Half of the activation buttons were unilluminated, yet I successfully procured a carbonated beverage to be dispensed. Jacob was leaning against the Trailblazer, navigating through his unpowered mobile device, likely anticipating a miraculous surge of service. It was at that juncture that I observed the engine of the white utility van was operating. Had it been running when we initially arrived? I was unable to recollect. The windows were darkly tinted, rendering interior visibility impossible. There was an inexplicable quality about it that caused my integument to tingle, but I suppressed the sensation. We were merely fatigued, experiencing apprehension derived from an excess of horror cinematics and an insufficiency of repose. Carlos emerged from the washroom, uttering jocular remarks concerning the inscriptions upon the partitions, and we all emitted laughter, our vocalizations excessively resonant in the silent night. Thomas had been absent for perhaps 5 minutes when we perceived it, a resonance akin to an individual depositing a cumbersome sack of concrete. Subsequently, there was an absolute cessation of sound. Jacob halted mid-sentence, and we all rotated our attention towards the sylvan expanse. The crickets had fallen silent. Even the atmospheric current appeared to hold its respiration. "Thomas," Jacob articulated, his vocalization exhibiting a slight tremor. There was no reply. Carlos commenced ambulating towards the arboreal area, but I seized his arm. The utility van's passenger side portal was now open. I was certain it had not been previously. A form moved within the obscure zones between the arboreal elements, too distant to be clearly distinguished. Then Thomas emerged from the woodlands in a stumbling manner, his facial complexion ashen as paper, his cigarette no longer present. He was moving with alacrity, almost in a sprint, casting glances backward every few paces as if something were pursuing him. "Enter the automobile," Thomas articulated, his vocalization barely audible above a hushed tone. Enter the automobile instantaneously. His entire corporeal frame was quivering, and there was a dark substance upon his footwear, perhaps mud or possibly something else. We refrained from posing inquiries. The demeanor in his ocular organs conveyed all the necessary information. Jacob fumbled with the ignition keys while we crammed ourselves inside. Thomas propelled himself into the rear seating area and immediately assumed a crouching posture. As Jacob initiated the engine's operation, I discerned movement in the vicinity of the utility van. A male individual emerged of considerable height, clad in coveralls and robust work boots. He was dragging something behind him, an object enveloped in a blue tarpaulin that left a dark trace upon the asphalt surface. The configuration was unequivocally of human dimensions. Our headlamps swept across him as Jacob forcefully engaged the vehicle in reverse, and for a mere instant our optical gazes intersected. His countenance was unexceptional, even forgettable, with the exception of a complete absence of discernible expression. He relinquished the object he was dragging and commenced walking towards our position. Jacob rapidly departed from that rest area, as if our very existence were contingent upon it, because indeed it was. The Explorer vehicle experienced a lateral skidding motion as we entered the main thoroughfare, its tires emitting a piercing shriek against the asphalt. Thomas was curled up on the floor of the back seating area, taking brief, agitated breaths. "He committed a homicide," he repeatedly asserted. "I witnessed him perform the act within the woodlands. He possessed a hammer or some similar implement, and he simply, God, there was an abundance of sanguine fluid." Carlos was contorted in his seat, observing the roadway behind our vehicle. Initially, there was naught but obscurity. Then, perhaps 2 minutes subsequently, a singular headlamp materialized in the remoteness. The utility van possessed only one functional headlamp. Jake propelled the speedometer beyond 90, then beyond 100. The aged trailblazer was vibrating as if it might disintegrate, but that solitary headlamp persistently drew nearer. "Precisely what did you observe?" I inquired of Thomas, endeavoring to maintain a steady vocal tone. He sat up slightly, continuing to observe the rear window. "I penetrated deeper into the woodlands than I had intended to. I also needed to urinate. There was this unwooded expanse, and I perceived the utility van parked in that locale, concealed from the rest area. The male individual was standing over someone, a female. I believe she was already prostrate upon the ground, exhibiting no movement. He struck her again nonetheless. merely to ensure her state. Then he commenced encasing her within that tarpaulin. Thomas's vocalization fractured. He saw me. I know he saw me. I endeavored to retreat with stealth, but I inadvertently stepped upon a branch. He gazed directly at me and exhibited a facial expression of a smile. The headlamp was now sufficiently proximate that we could discern the outline of the utility van. It was not attempting to overtake us, merely maintaining its position directly upon our tail, precisely matching our velocity. Jake exited the highway without prior notification, the tires emitting a squealing sound in an attempt to elude him. The utility van continued its pursuit. We were now upon a secondary county thoroughfare, more constricted and darker than the principal highway. There were no street illumination fixtures, no residential dwellings, merely agricultural fields of maize extending on both lateral aspects. The utility van abruptly accelerated, colliding with our rear bumper. The trailblazer lurched forward and Jake nearly lost manipulative control. Carlos was utilizing his mobile device, attempting desperately to acquire a signal to initiate a distress call. Nothing. The utility van struck us again with increased force. This time I could perceive the sound of metal being compressed. "There," I exclaimed, indicating a fuel station sign glowing in the remoteness. "Proceed there." Jake propelled the vehicle, its engine emitting a protesting shriek. The utility van momentarily receded, and I conjectured that perhaps we had escaped him. Then his high-intensity headlamps activated, temporarily incapacitating our vision. He approached us from the side on this occasion, endeavoring to compel us off the thoroughfare. Jake sharply maneuvered the steering wheel to the right, and we skidded onto the unpaved shoulder with gravel being ejected in all directions. The fuel station was one of those 24-hour truck service centers, brightly illuminated and bustling even at 4 a.m. in the morning. Jake skidded into the parking expanse, narrowly avoiding impact with a diesel fueling apparatus. We all disembarked rapidly and ran towards the entrance portal. I cast a single glance backward and observed the utility van idling at the periphery of the lot, just outside the circumference of the illumination. The operator remained within, observing us. Internally, the establishment was replete with long-haul transporters and peregrinators. Ordinary individuals conducting routine existences, utterly unaware of the ordeal we had just undergone. Carlos located a security personnel and commenced articulating incoherently about the pursuit, the homicide, and all related events. The security personnel appeared skeptical until he perceived our facial expressions. 4 recent university graduates, absolutely terror-stricken, covered in perspiration and trembling. He radioed for law enforcement while we huddled near the coffee dispensing machines. Through the glazed aperture, I observed the utility van remain stationary for another 60 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes. Then it slowly reversed and vanished into the darkness. The law enforcement officers arrived 20 minutes later, a pair of state troopers who recorded our official declarations with a degree of forbearance that conveyed to me their prior familiarity with such narratives. They summoned additional units to inspect the rest area. We remained in that truck service center for 3 hours, consuming coffee and recoiling each time an individual traversed the entrance. Approximately at 7 in the morning, one of the troopers returned to provide us with an update. They had discovered the location Thomas had described. Sanguine fluid in the clearing, drag marks, and tire impressions from the utility van were present, but there was no corporeal remains. No utility van, and no operator. They issued an all-points bulletin and informed us we would need to attend the station later to examine photographic evidence, perhaps collaborate with a forensic artist. The Explorer's rear bumper was compressed, the paint abraded along the entirety of the driver's side. This served as corroboration that the events had indeed transpired, that we were not merely 4 young individuals with overly imaginative minds. We ultimately reached Chicago after providing official depositions and having the automobile inspected. The constabulary contacted us several times over the subsequent weeks with updates. They had uncovered similar criminal scenes at other rest areas, extending back for years. The modus operandi was identical, and the same type of utility van had been observed in proximity. They never apprehended the perpetrator. Thomas subsequently returned to his domicile in Nebraska. He stated he was unable to cope with being separated from his familial unit. Jacob still refuses to operate a vehicle during nocturnal hours. Carlos became intensely engrossed in true crime audio series, attempting to discover analogous instances. As for myself, I continue to reside in Chicago, still employed at the technology enterprise, but I have never again traversed that specific route. Occasionally, I consult the news for reports concerning homicides at rest areas, pondering if he remains at large. The detective assigned to our particular investigation retired last year, but she contacted me prior to her departure. She stated that ours was among the fortunate few, those who successfully escaped. She also articulated something that continues to deprive me of slumber. They had located 12 cadavers over the years, all young women, all slain in the identical manner Thomas had delineated. We had disrupted his actions that evening. Had we not arrived at the precise moment we did, there would have been 13. Story 2. The Desert Stop Encounter. I was 23 years of age and freshly graduated from university, operating my somewhat worn Roadmaster compact car from Albuquerque to Los Angeles for my inaugural substantial employment opportunity at Vantage Marketing Group. It was late September 2022, one of those arid, desolate nights where the atmospheric temperature plummets 30 degrees following the setting of the sun, and the celestial bodies appear sufficiently close to be within reach. I had been traveling for approximately 6 hours, sustaining myself on stimulant beverages and whatever audio content could maintain my wakefulness. The thoroughfare extended interminably before me, nothing but profound darkness and the infrequent pair of rubescent rear lights vanishing into the distance. I recall experiencing a sense of invincibility at that time, as if no adverse event could befall an individual whose entire existence was meticulously preordained. My parental figures had cautioned me against operating a vehicle alone through the desert during nocturnal hours, but I had dismissively disregarded their admonitions with the self-assuredness only possessed by someone who had never encountered genuine peril. Around 2 a.m., somewhere beyond the Arizona state boundary, my urinary bladder commenced demanding immediate attention. I had been restraining myself for the past 60 minutes, anticipating reaching a more sizable municipality, but the subsequent exit indication promised available amenities, and I was unable to endure any longer. The off-ramp led to a singular fuel station, one of those archaic establishments featuring flickering fluorescent luminaries and fuel dispensers that likely had not undergone modernization since the 1990s. A faded inscription read, "Desert Stop 24 Hours," in lettering that exhibited missing portions of paint. Only one other vehicle was situated in the parking area, a corroded pickup truck parked askew near the air inflation apparatus. I maneuvered my vehicle to pump 3, nearest to the edifice, and deactivated the engine. Through the grimy windows, I could perceive a retail attendant slumped behind the counter, the blue radiance of his mobile device illuminating his countenance. The locale instilled within me a sense of disquiet, but biological necessity exerted a stronger pull than my intuitive instincts. I grasped my keys but inadvertently left my handbag on the passenger seating area. This was my initial egregious error. The arid desert air impacted me like glacial water when I disembarked, and I could discern the howling of wild canines somewhere in the distance. My open-toed sandals slapped against the fissured asphalt. As I hastened towards the vitreous portals, they were adorned with handwritten notices advertising chilled beer and freshly brewed coffee inscribed in marker that had faded to a pale blue hue. The door chime emitted an egregious grinding sound when I pushed inside, akin to metallic abrasion against metal. The retail attendant, an individual perhaps in his 40s, sporting a grease-stained baseball cap, barely elevated his gaze from his mobile device. The public convenience facility was situated at the rear, beyond aisles of dusty potato chips and confections that appeared to have been present since the establishment's inception. The key was affixed to a wooden block of brick-like dimensions, with the word "Ladies" intricately carved into its surface. I distinctly recall contemplating its repugnant nature, considering the multitude of hands that had previously contacted the object. The public convenience facility was precisely what one would anticipate. It comprised a singular cubicle with a door that did not fully secure itself correctly. Inscriptions covered every surface, and a mirror was so marred with scratches that one could barely perceive one's reflection. The fluorescent luminary buzzed and flickered, casting peculiar shadows that impelled me to accelerate my actions. I completed my necessary functions with utmost celerity, endeavoring to avoid contact with any surface beyond the absolute minimum. The liquid soap dispenser was devoid of contents, so I managed with only water, drying my hands upon my denim trousers. Upon my egress, I observed that the retail attendant had changed his position. He was now standing near the window, gazing out at the parking area. Something about his stance caused me to pause. He was rigid, observing something with intense focus. However, when I followed his line of sight, I merely perceived my automobile parked there under the harsh illumination. I deposited the public convenience key upon the counter with a resonant clang and proceeded back outside, eager to recommence my journey and leave this unsettling location behind me. The frigid air impacted me again as I pushed through the entrance portals, and it was at that instant that I perceived him. There was a male individual seated in my driver's seat, simply sitting there, his hands resting upon my steering wheel, gazing directly forward as if he belonged there. My cognitive faculties were initially unable to process the visual information. I actually advanced several more steps towards the vehicle before the stark reality abruptly assailed me. This unfamiliar individual, this man I had never previously encountered, was inside my secured automobile. He was clad in a faded denim outerwear with discolorations down the frontal portion, and even from 20 feet distant, I could discern his hair was lank and unwashed, cascading past his shoulders. My handbag was no longer present on the passenger seating area. The logical part of my cerebrum was screaming at me to re-enter the establishment, to seek assistance, but my lower extremities continued to propel me forward as if I were operating on an automatic pilot. Perhaps it was emotional shock. Perhaps it was an act of imprudent courage. But I found myself standing directly adjacent to my automobile, gazing at this individual through the window. He slowly rotated his cranium to observe me, and his visage will forever remain imprinted upon my memory. He possessed these pale, ashen ocular organs that appeared almost white under the fuel station's luminaries, and a cicatrix that extended from his left superciliary arch down to his mandibular bone, contorting his mouth into a perpetual sneer. He then directed a smile towards me, not a typical smile, but this slow, deliberate extension of his labial structures that caused my dermis to crawl. With extreme composure, as if we were long-acquainted associates, he extended his hand and pressed the unlock mechanism. The metallic click of the security mechanisms disengaging resonated like a firearm discharge in the quiescent night. He opened the portal and stepped out, my handbag suspended from his right hand. He was taller than I had anticipated, perhaps 6 feet 3 inches, and exceedingly slender. The olfactory sensation immediately assailed me. Corporeal effluvium mingled with an ambiguous chemical substance akin to paint thinner. "Pleasant night for a drive," he articulated, and his vocalization was soft, almost gentle, which paradoxically rendered it more disconcerting. I opened my oral cavity to emit a scream, but no sound emanated. My fauces had completely constricted. It was at that moment that my innate survival mechanism finally activated. I rapidly rotated and fled, my open-toed sandals detaching from my feet within the initial few steps. The asphalt lacerated my unprotected soles, but I remained unconcerned. I could perceive him behind me, the weighty sound of his boots impacting the ground, drawing nearer. I was approximately 10 feet from the fuel station entrance when he apprehended me. His hand grasped a handful of my hair and pulled backward with such force that I feared my cervical vertebrae would fracture. I impacted the ground forcefully, my cubital region scraping across the rough pavement. Finally, I discovered my voice and emitted a scream, the loudest, most desperate sound I had ever produced in my existence. He was upon me instantaneously. One hand clamped over my mouth, the other arm enveloped my waist. I bit down fiercely upon his palm and perceived the taste of sanguine fluid. He cursed and relaxed his grip just sufficiently for me to emit another scream. Through the fuel station window, I could observe the retail attendant. He was standing there, observing us, his mobile device within his hand. But he was not initiating a call to anyone. He was not advancing to render aid. He merely stood there observing as if we were some form of public spectacle. The male individual was now dragging me, pulling me back towards my automobile. My bare lower extremities scraped ineffectually against the ground, leaving bloody streaks upon the pavement. I clutched at anything within my reach. The air hose, a refuse receptacle, even attempted to embed my digits into a fissure in the asphalt. Nothing proved efficacious. He was excessively powerful, and I was experiencing increasing fatigue. My fauces were raw from prolonged screaming, and obscure spots were commencing to undulate at the periphery of my visual field. "This is how I shall perish," I recall contemplating, in a fuel station parking expanse in the absolute middle of nowhere, and that attendant is simply going to witness it transpire. But then I perceived it, the profound reverberation of a diesel engine. Headlights swept across the parking expanse as an 18-wheel transport vehicle departed the highway. The male individual dragging me paused, his grip slightly loosening as he rotated to observe. The truck's pneumatic brakes hissed as it decelerated to a halt, and the operator's portal opened before the vehicle had even completely ceased motion. A female individual descended, likely in her 50s, of robust build, clad in a checkered shirt and work boots. She assessed the predicament with a single glance and exhibited no hesitation. "Release her," she roared, and her vocalization resonated like thunder. She held an object in her hand, which I subsequently realized was a tire iron. The man immediately relinquished his hold on me, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. He exchanged gazes between myself and the truck operator, calculating his probabilities. She was already advancing towards us, that tire iron grasped as if it were a baseball bat. I said, "Release her and depart this vicinity immediately before I fracture your cranium," she growled. Behind her, I could observe she had left her transport vehicle's engine running, the citizen's band radio emitting crackling sounds with multiple vocalizations. She must have initiated a call for assistance while pulling into the lot. The man retreated a single step backward, then another. He dropped my handbag onto the ground and elevated his hands as if surrendering, but his ocular organs never deviated from mine, and that terrifying smile had reappeared on his countenance. "I shall see you around," he articulated quietly, just audibly enough for me to perceive. Then he rotated and fled, vanishing into the obscurity beyond the fuel station luminaries. The truck operator did not pursue him. Instead, she knelt beside me, her coarse hand surprisingly gentle as she aided me in assuming a seated posture. "Are you all right, dear? Did he injure you severely?" she inquired, her vocalization now completely altered, soft and nurturing. I was unable to vocalize yet, merely shook my cranium and indicated my fosses. She immediately comprehended. "Do not endeavor to speak. Let us get you inside and contact the legitimate law enforcement officers. That ineffectual piece of refuse in there." She gestured her head towards the attendant, who had finally emerged outside but was maintaining his distance. "Obviously will not be of any assistance." She assisted me in rising to my feet, and I nearly collapsed again when I attempted to bear weight upon my lacerated soles. Without hesitation, she lifted me as if I weighed nothing and transported me to her truck. She positioned me on the passenger seating area and retrieved a first aid apparatus from behind the seat. While she cleansed my feet and enveloped them in absorbent material, she maintained a continuous flow of discourse, informing me her appellation was Brenda, that she had been operating transport vehicles for 30 years, and that she had witnessed sufficient occurrences to recognize when something adverse was transpiring. "That man," she articulated, extracting her cellular communication device. "I have encountered him previously, approximately 2 weeks ago, at a rest stop in the vicinity of Flagstaff. He was loitering around the female public convenience facility, and security personnel compelled him to depart." She dialed emergency services and activated the speaker function so I could overhear. The law enforcement officers arrived within 20 minutes. Apparently, there was a state trooper who had been patrolling merely a few miles distant. By that point, I had regained my vocalization, although it emerged as a hoarse whisper. I provided my official declaration right there in Brenda's truck, while she held my hand. The trooper, Officer Fitzgerald, was young but exceedingly meticulous. He captured photographic evidence of my injuries, the sanguine fluid upon the pavement, and acquired the surveillance recordings from the fuel station. The attendant attempted to furtively depart, but Officer Fitzgerald was not amenable to such actions. It transpired that the attendant had observed the entire sequence of events. From the commencement, witnessed the male individual forcibly open my automobile's portal with some form of implement. He witnessed him rummaging through my personal effects and failed to take any remedial action whatsoever. "I desired no predicament," the attendant repeatedly asserted, but Officer Fitzgerald's facial expression merely intensified with each successive justification. When they processed the description Brenda and I provided, an intriguing detail emerged within their informational system. A male individual precisely matching that description, extending to the cicatrix, was sought in connection with 3 abductions across Arizona and New Mexico. His appellation was Robert Henley, and he had been systematically targeting young women traveling unaccompanied, invariably at isolated fuel stations or rest areas. The aspect that continues to induce nocturnal terrors within me is what they discovered when they searched the vicinity. Robert's pickup truck, that corroded utility vehicle I had perceived upon my arrival, was concealed behind the station. In the cargo bed, beneath a tarpaulin, they found plastic cable ties, a roll of adhesive tape, and a digging implement. There was also a written record containing detailed observations concerning various women he had been monitoring, including their license plate identifiers and travel routes. My license plate identifier was not yet recorded therein, signifying that I was an incidental target of opportunity. Officer Fitzgerald subsequently informed me that I was fortunate. The other 3 women who had encountered Robert Henley had not been seen again. Brenda remained with me throughout the entire ordeal. even accompanying me to the adjacent municipality to ensure I secured a motel room safely. She provided me with her telephone number and elicited a promise to contact her upon my arrival in Los Angeles. The law enforcement impounded my automobile as evidentiary material. Thus, I was compelled to lease one to conclude my journey. They apprehended Robert 2 days later at another fuel station 50 miles to the west, attempting the identical action with another female. This time, the attendant promptly initiated an emergency call. He is currently serving a life sentence, and those 3 missing women were never located. I still periodically operate a vehicle to California for professional reasons, but I never halt at isolated fuel stations anymore. And I perpetually remember Brenda, the transporter who exhibited no hesitation in preserving the existence of a stranger. Story 3: The Unmarked Patrol Car. During my formative years in a diminutive Utah community, I consistently believed the most perilous aspect of nocturnal driving was colliding with a cervide. This perception underwent a complete transformation during the spring recess of 2017 when my younger sister, Megan, and I resolved to visit our maternal aunt in Phoenix. I was 23 years of age then, employed as a dental hygienist in Salt Lake City, and Megan had just attained her 21st year, finalizing her nursing degree at Highland University. We had undertaken this journey dozens of times previously, typically departing after my Friday professional engagement to circumvent the weekend vehicular congestion. That particular evening, we commenced our journey around 8:30 p.m., intending to reach Phoenix by 3:00 in the morning. The meteorological conditions were clear, the roadways were unpopulated, and we possessed a refrigerated container replete with stimulant beverages and those roadside convenience store prepared snacks Megan adored immensely. We were situated somewhere beyond Cedar City, likely 2 hours into our journey, when I first perceived the headlamps in my rear view mirror. The interstate highway was virtually deserted at that hour, with only ourselves and the occasional long-haul truck operator proceeding southward. This particular automobile had been positioned behind us for perhaps 15 minutes, maintaining a consistent interval, never approaching excessively close or receding excessively far. Megan was dozing in the passenger seating area, her lower extremities elevated upon the dashboard, despite my incessant remonstrances concerning safety. The radio was broadcasting a late-night discussion program concerning governmental surveillance theories, the host's vocalization droning on about them. I distinctly recall pondering the irony of that particular program given the impending events. The automobile behind us abruptly accelerated, closing the distance between us in mere seconds. Then the rubescent and cerulean illumination began flashing. The initial detail that struck me as anomalous was the vehicle itself. It did not resemble a conventional law enforcement cruiser. There were no distinctive markings, no roof-mounted light bar, solely those portable luminaries purchasable online, affixed to the dashboard. However, I had heard about unmarked law enforcement vehicles previously, particularly on these extended sections of highway where they apprehend speed violators. I nudged Megan into wakefulness and commenced decelerating, seeking a secure location to pull over. The shoulder was narrow, barely wide enough for an automobile, with nothing but sagebrush and obscurity beyond. Megan sat upright, groggy, squinting at the lights positioned behind us. "Were you exceeding the speed limit?" she inquired, rubbing her ocular organs. I was not. I had set my cruise control at precisely 75 miles per hour since our departure from Cedar City. The unmarked vehicle closely followed us as I carefully guided our car onto the shoulder, gravel emitting a crunching sound beneath our tires. Through the side mirror, I observed a figure emerge from the vehicle positioned behind us. He was tall, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, clad in dark denim trousers and what appeared to be a plain black windbreaker. There was no uniform, no visible badge. He ambulated with this peculiar, deliberate gait, akin to an individual exerting excessive effort to appear authoritative. The manner of his movement caused every nerve in my physiological system to constrict. He maintained one hand resting upon his hip, where a firearm might be located, although I was unable to discern one in the darkness. His other hand held a portable light source, but he kept it directed downwards towards the ground instead of utilizing it for improved visibility. When he reached my window, I only lowered it by approximately 2 inches. In close proximity, I could clearly perceive his countenance, cleanly shaven, likely in his mid-40s, with deeply set ocular organs and this distinct cicatrix that extended from his left ear down to his mandibular bone, as if someone had attempted to delineate a question mark upon his visage. "Operator's permit and vehicle registration," he articulated, but his vocalization was incorrect, excessively hushed, almost whispered, as if he desired no other individual to overhear. He did not identify himself as a law enforcement officer. He did not inform us of the reason for our vehicular stop, merely stood there awaiting a response. Megan had become completely motionless beside me. I could discern her respiration, rapid and shallow. My handbag was situated in the rear seating area, and as I reached for it, he abruptly spoke again. "Both of you. I require both of you to disembark from the vehicle." The manner in which he articulated it caused a frigid sensation to permeate my veins. It was not a solicitation, but a peremptory command. His unencumbered hand moved to his hip once more, his digits rhythmically drumming against an object I still could not clearly perceive. "Is there a predicament, officer?" I inquired, endeavoring to maintain a steady vocal tone. He refrained from responding, merely reiterated his command with greater volume this time. "Out of the vehicle immediately." Megan grasped my arm, her fingernails puncturing my dermis. Neither of us performed any movement. It was at that precise moment that we perceived the second pair of headlamps approaching from behind. Another automobile was decelerating, and this time I could clearly discern the appellation Sheriff inscribed upon its side in luminescent lettering. The male individual at my window also perceived it. His entire bearing underwent an instantaneous transformation. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and he took a rapid step backward from my automobile. The sheriff's patrol vehicle pulled up directly behind the unmarked automobile, and I observed in my mirror as a uniformed deputy exited. She was shorter than the initial male, of solid build, with her hand already positioned upon her radio apparatus. The instant she perceived him, she drew her weapon. "Step away from that vehicle and place your hands where I can see them," she exclaimed. The male individual with the cicatrix did not flee. He simply stood there momentarily, observing me through my window with an expression I shall never forget, akin to a predator whose pursuit had just been interrupted. What transpired next was sheer pandemonium. The deputy continued to shout directives while communicating for reinforcement on her radio. The male slowly elevated his hands but maintained his gaze fixed upon us, specifically upon Megan. Even with a firearm pointed at him, he appeared more exasperated than apprehensive. The deputy commanded him to retreat backward towards her vocalization, to assume a kneeling posture, the entire protocol observed on televised programs. But the manner in which she was managing the situation, the urgency in her vocalization, indicated this was not a routine vehicular stop. She recognized his identity. "You two remain within your vehicle with the portals secured," she called out to us without averting her gaze from him. We did not require a second instruction. I activated the locking mechanism with such force that I feared I might fracture it. Throughout the entire episode, the male individual uttered not a single word, merely adhered to her commands with this unsettling composure that exacerbated everything. Within minutes, the deserted highway underwent a metamorphosis into a scene from a cinematic production. 3 additional patrol automobiles arrived, their sirens blaring, saturating the area with rubescent and cerulean illumination. Deputies encircled the man's automobile, inspecting it with portable lights, while he remained handcuffed in the rear of the original deputy's patrol vehicle. The female deputy who had rescued us approached to inquire about our well-being. Her identification tag indicated Deputy Vasquez, and in close proximity, I could discern the commingling of relief and indignation upon her countenance. "You two acted appropriately by not disembarking," she articulated, glancing back at the man in her automobile. "We have been seeking him for 3 months." Nathan Crow. That is not even his authentic appellation, merely the most recent one he has been employing. She elucidated that he had been executing this identical stratagem across 3 states, Utah, Nevada, and Colorado. He invariably targeted young women traveling alone or in pairs, invariably during nocturnal hours, invariably on isolated stretches of highway. He had attempted to abduct a minimum of 4 women that they were aware of, although Deputy Vasquez suggested there were likely more who had not reported the incidents. The search of his automobile unveiled all the necessary information concerning the proximity of our impending catastrophe. They discovered plastic cable ties, a roll of adhesive tape, a purloined police radio scanner, and those magnetic emergency luminaries readily available for online purchase. In his glove compartment, they uncovered multiple counterfeit identification documents bearing various names, but all featuring his scarred countenance. There was also a written record filled with license plate identifiers, descriptions of vehicles, and notations concerning potential stopping points. Deputy Vasquez would not permit us to examine it, but her expression conveyed sufficient information. The most disquieting discovery was a police uniform, complete with a badge that appeared sufficiently authentic to deceive anyone in the darkness. He had been escalating his actions, becoming bolder with each attempt. The deputy informed us that in Colorado he had actually succeeded in compelling a woman to exit her automobile before a passing long-haul truck operator deterred him. She had been missing for 6 hours before they located her, traumatized but alive, abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles distant. Megan had not uttered a single word since the deputy commenced her explanation. She sat there gripping my hand, tears streaming down her countenance. Deputy Vasquez inquired if we desired to press criminal charges, which seemed like an absurd inquiry until she explained that some victims chose not to, being too shaken to proceed with testimony. We both immediately assented. She recorded our official declarations right there on the shoulder of the highway, the desert wind whipping through the sagebrush surrounding us. Every minute detail now felt significant. The duration he had pursued us, his precise verbalizations, that distinctive cicatrix. Other deputies photographed our automobile, the precise location where we had halted, even the tire impressions in the gravel. One of them mentioned that Crow had likely been monitoring police communication channels, awaiting a nocturnal period when patrol units were sparsely distributed. Had Deputy Vasquez not been returning from a domestic altercation call merely 5 miles distant, circumstances would have concluded far differently. They detained us there for nearly 2 hours, ensuring we were capable of operating a vehicle and collecting every conceivable piece of evidentiary material. Deputy Vasquez provided us with her direct telephone number and elicited a promise to contact her upon our arrival in Phoenix. She also arranged for a patrol automobile to accompany us to the subsequent municipality merely for safety. As we prepared to depart, I observed them loading Crow into a transport vehicle. He was gazing directly at our automobile once more, and even from that distance, I could discern him mouthing something. I shall never ascertain what he articulated, and for that I am grateful. The deputy also noticed and stepped between us, obstructing his view. "Do not grant him any more of your energy," she articulated. "He is going to be incarcerated for an extended period." We subsequently learned that he was already under conditional release for an assault charge originating in 2015, which implied this would constitute a violation of his terms. Combined with the attempted abductions and impersonation of a law enforcement officer, Deputy Vasquez estimated he would receive a minimum sentence of 15 to 20 years. The remainder of our journey to Phoenix was surreal. Megan and I barely conversed, merely held hands across the central console while I operated the vehicle at precisely the posted speed limit, with both hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Every automobile that appeared in my mirrors caused my cardiac rate to accelerate. We stopped once for fuel in St. George, and I was unable to compel myself to disembark. Megan was compelled to operate the fuel pump while I remained seated within the locked vehicle, scanning the parking area. We arrived at our maternal aunt's residence just as the solar orb was ascending, exhausted and shaken but secure. The subsequent few months proved arduous. I experienced nocturnal terrors concerning that cicatrix, concerning being compelled to stop on obscure roadways. Megan transitioned to daytime professional shifts at the medical facility after graduating, unable to operate a vehicle during nocturnal hours anymore. We both provided testimony at his legal proceeding 6 months subsequently, alongside 3 other women he had targeted. He was found culpable on all charges and received an 18-year sentence. The prosecuting attorney stated that our particular case was the most compelling because we had remained inside the automobile, and Deputy Vasquez had apprehended him in the act. These days, I still undertake that journey to Phoenix periodically, but never during nocturnal hours. And I consistently advise individuals, if something feels amiss during a vehicular stop by law enforcement, rely upon your intuitive judgment. Genuine officers will not object if you initiate a distress call to verify their identity. That hesitation, that secured portal, those 2 inches of lowered window, they preserved our lives that evening. Story 4. The Old Route's Terrors. The automotive technician at the fuel station possessed grease beneath his fingernails and a diastema between his anterior dentition that emitted a whistling sound when he articulated. Brandon and I had driven into his workshop just beyond Hullbrook because the pickup truck we had borrowed from his elder brother was producing a grinding noise whenever we attained a velocity of 60 miles per hour. The individual informed us it was merely the heat shield rattling, nothing of serious concern. He then mentioned we could conserve approximately 2 hours of travel time to Phoenix if we utilized what he termed the old cattle road instead of remaining on the interstate highway. He sketched for us a rudimentary cartographic representation on the reverse side of our transaction receipt, his hands leaving oily smudges upon the paper. He instructed us to exit at mile marker 47, follow the unpaved thoroughfare for approximately 20 miles until we perceived a yellow elevated water storage tank, then execute a left turn, sufficiently straightforward, and we were already experiencing a delay because we had expended excessive time at the petrified forest that morning. This occurred around 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The solar radiation was intense even in March, and the air conditioning in Brandon's brother's truck barely functioned. We had our windows lowered, music volume elevated, merely 2 20-year-old individuals from Michigan, believing we were experiencing the greatest adventure of our lives. Brandon persistently performed this action where he would extend his hand out of the window and permit it to glide through the air current while I operated the vehicle, occasionally indicating unusual rock formations or abandoned structures we passed. We had been cohabitants since our freshman academic year, having formed a bond over late-night video game tournaments and our shared aversion for our calculus professor. This expedition was intended to be our final genuine intermission before we were compelled to commence contemplating professional internships and real-world responsibilities. Neither of us possessed any foreknowledge that by sunset, we would be questioning whether we would ever successfully return to our place of origin. Mile marker 47 appeared more rapidly than anticipated. The turnoff was scarcely discernible, merely a gap in the guardrail with an unpaved thoroughfare extending into the desert. No signage. Nothing. Brandon double-checked the receipt map while I decelerated, and we could still discern the mechanic's pencil markings indicating this was the correct location. The roadway commenced in a reasonably passable condition, consisting of compacted dirt with infrequent depressions. We passed a few derelict structures within the initial couple of miles, an aged fuel pump standing alone like a metallic framework, a collapsed wooden shack with a portal suspended from a single hinge. Brandon was capturing images with his mobile device, asserting that his social media followers back home would enthusiastically engage with such content. The geographical terrain was distinct from anything we had previously encountered in Michigan. It was entirely characterized by rubescent rock formations and scraggly bushes adorned with these tall cacti that appeared to be saluting us. Approximately 10 miles into our journey, circumstances began to manifest in an unusual manner. The roadway narrowed and became more uneven, compelling me to reduce our velocity to perhaps 15 miles per hour. We had not observed another automobile since our departure from the highway, and our mobile devices had completely lost network connectivity approximately 5 miles prior. The yellow elevated water storage tank the mechanic had referenced was nowhere within sight. Instead, we commenced observing these makeshift cruciform structures along the roadside, fabricated from aged fence posts and enveloped in faded fabric. Initially, there were merely a few, but then they began to appear every 100 yards or so. Some possessed artificial floral attachments, bleached pallid by the solar radiation. Others had diminutive objects suspended from them, keys, decorative ribbons, what appeared to be children's playthings. Brandon ceased capturing images and became quiet, which was uncharacteristic of him. The auditory content from the radio had devolved into static, so I deactivated it. The sole sounds were the truck's operational engine and the abrasive sound of tires traversing dirt. 20 miles into the journey, still no elevated water storage tank. The receipt map indicated it should have appeared by now, but all we could perceive was more desert and a ridge of rubescent rock formations in the distance. Brandon suggested we reverse direction, but I desired to proceed just a little further. We had already traversed this considerable distance, and executing a reversal on the constricted roadway would prove challenging. It was at that precise moment that we perceived the initial piece of footwear. It was suspended from a mesquite tree branch, a small pink athletic shoe that could not have exceeded a size 3. Then we perceived more. Boots, open sandals, athletic footwear, all differing in dimensions and designs, strung up in the arboreal elements like some sort of bizarre fruit. They swayed in the gentle breeze, emitting this soft creaking sound. Some were bleached by the sun and disintegrating. Others appeared almost pristine. There must have been hundreds of them dispersed across perhaps a dozen trees. Brandon seized my arm and instructed me to halt the truck. His vocalization was different, higher than its normal register. We remained seated there for a minute, the engine idling, merely gazing at those shoes slowly rotating in the air current. The farmstead materialized around the subsequent bend, akin to something originating from a distressing dream. The primary residential structure was partially collapsed. Its roof caved in on one lateral aspect, windows reduced to nothing but dark apertures. But it was the agricultural building that caused both of us to momentarily cease respiration. The entire framework was covered in what appeared to be fragments of dolls, arms, legs, craniums, all affixed by nails to the weathered timber in no discernible pattern. In front of the agricultural building, someone had meticulously arranged dozens of infant transport carriages in a perfect circular formation, all facing inwards. The carriages exhibited varying ages and designs, ranging from contemporary strollers to antiquated prams with sizable wheels. Auditory devices fabricated from osseous material, or what appeared to be osseous material, were suspended from every available surface, generating this ceaseless hollow clacking resonance. The access path was obstructed by an aged school bus devoid of wheels, its yellow paint peeling off in sections. Someone had inscribed words across its side in rubescent pigment, Matthew 19:14. Brandon was now breathing rapidly, almost hyperventilating. I engaged the truck in reverse, prepared to extricate us from that location, but the roadway was excessively narrow to execute a rapid reversal. It was at that precise moment that I perceived him in the agricultural building's upper window. Initially, merely a silhouette, but unequivocally a human individual standing perfectly still and observing us. He exhibited no movement whatsoever, not even to respire, it seemed, simply standing there like a scarecrow. I was unable to discern his facial features, but I could perceive his gaze. Brandon also perceived him and emitted a sound I had never previously heard him produce, somewhere between an abrupt intake of breath and a soft whimper. I commenced reversing more rapidly, no longer concerned with maintaining precise alignment on the roadway, merely desiring to establish distance between ourselves and that location. The truck's tires rotated in the loose dirt, generating clouds of dust. Through the dissipating dust, I could observe the figure in the window had not shifted by an inch. But now there was movement near the residential structure. A portal I had not previously noticed was slowly opening. The hinges must have been corroded because they emitted this prolonged grinding screech that permeated the arid desert air. Someone was emerging, but they moved in this peculiar, erratic manner, as if they were experiencing difficulty ambulating. The sound of an engine behind us caused my entire corporeal frame to become rigid. In the rear-view mirror, I could perceive a pickup truck had positioned itself across the roadway, approximately 50 yards behind us, obstructing our sole exit. It was an aged workhorse vehicle, primer gray with mismatched portals, and it had simply materialized from nowhere. We had not perceived its approach whatsoever. Two male individuals disembarked, and even from that distance I could discern both were carrying something. Brandon was repeatedly articulating, "Go, go, go," his vocalization fracturing. I propelled the vehicle forward, tires rotating, attempting to locate space to reverse direction between the school bus and a cluster of corroded agricultural machinery. The individual from the residential structure was drawing nearer, and now I could discern it was a female in a long, soiled dress. She was dragging something behind her that left a trace in the dirt. The male individuals from the truck were also walking towards us, not running, merely ambulating with this dreadful self-assurance, as if they knew we possessed no means of escape. One of them was clad in what appeared to be a butcher's protective garment, darkly stained across the frontal portion. I finally located a gap between the bus and an aged tractor, barely wide enough for the pickup truck. I vigorously rotated the steering wheel and fully depressed the accelerator, the truck's side mirror scraping against the bus with a horrifying shriek. We bounced over something, I do not know what, and abruptly we were past the farmstead, rapidly descending a lateral path I had not previously observed. It was even narrower than the primary thoroughfare, barely more than 2 tire tracks through the brush. Brandon was rotated in his seat, observing behind us. He stated they were pursuing us with both vehicles now, and they possessed a superior familiarity with the terrain than we did. The path twisted through a thicket of deceased arboreal elements, their pallid trunks resembling osseous structures protruding from the ground. I was operating the vehicle at an excessive velocity for the prevailing conditions, the truck skidding around turns, bottoming out on rocks, but I was unable to decelerate. In the mirror, I could observe the gray workhorse maintaining pace with ease, and behind it, another vehicle, perhaps the one the female had originated from. The speedometer was fluctuating between 40 and 50 miles per hour, which felt like 100 on that surface. The path abruptly opened onto another unpaved thoroughfare, wider and better maintained. I was uncertain which direction to proceed, so I merely turned right and offered a supplication that it led back to the highway. Brandon was again attempting to utilize his mobile device, holding it aloft, desperate for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The solar orb was descending, perhaps an hour from setting, and the shadows were extending across the roadway like dark digits. I could perceive dust clouds in the mirror. They were still approaching. It was at that precise moment that Brandon observed the projectile hole in the tailgate. It was fresh, judging by its dimensions, likely created while we were fleeing. Neither of us had perceived a gunshot. The roadway commenced ascending into some elevated terrain, and I propelled the aged pickup truck as forcefully as it could possibly go. The engine was emitting discontented sounds, the temperature indicator creeping towards the rubescent zone. We rounded a sharp curve and nearly collided head-on with a sheriff's deputy's automobile, approaching from the opposite direction. I abruptly applied the brakes and we ended up positioned sideways across the roadway. The deputy disembarked, his hand upon his weapon, and it was then that I comprehended our likely appearance. Covered in dust, obviously terrified, operating a vehicle in a frenzied manner. Brandon was outside the truck before it even ceased motion, stumbling towards the deputy, endeavoring to explain about the farmstead and the individuals pursuing us. His words were emerging in a jumbled fashion. The deputy, whose identification plate indicated Officer Briggs, raised a hand to calm him, then cast a glance past us down the road from which we had just emerged. No dust clouds, no vehicles, merely an empty roadway disappearing into the desert. He walked around our truck, halted at the projectile hole, and ran his digit along its edge. Then he requested us to decelerate and recount the events from the beginning. I informed him about the mechanic, the shortcut, everything we had witnessed. While I spoke, he continuously glanced down the road, and I observed his hand never departed from his weapon holster. When I concluded, he remained silent for a prolonged period. Then he instructed us to follow him back to the highway. He stated we had been fortunate. The area we had traversed was private property, he explained, and the inhabitants of that locale did not look kindly upon unauthorized entrance. He would not elaborate beyond that, merely reiterated that we were fortunate. We followed Officer Briggs for approximately 20 minutes on roadways I never could have located independently. Neither Brandon nor I spoke for the entirety of the duration. When we finally reached the asphalt surface of the interstate, the sense of relief was overwhelming. The deputy pulled over at the on-ramp, approached my window, and instructed us to proceed directly to Phoenix without making any stops. Do not utilize any more shortcuts, he articulated. Adhere to the primary thoroughfares. Then he articulated something that continues to induce shivers within me. And if you young men are sagacious, you will dismiss the notion of submitting any form of report concerning this matter. Sometimes it is preferable to simply be grateful you managed to escape. He waited until we had entered the highway before reversing direction and proceeding back the way we had come. Brandon and I operated the vehicle for 3 continuous hours before halting well within the Phoenix metropolitan limits at a brightly illuminated truck service center replete with individuals. We never made it to Texas. Instead, we reversed direction the subsequent morning and drove directly back to Michigan, taking turns operating the vehicle, halting only for fuel. We never discussed submitting a report. We never even informed Brandon's brother about the projectile hole. We asserted it must have been present previously, and we had simply not noticed it. But occasionally late at night, I will search online for that specific area, endeavoring to locate any mention of the farmstead or the cruciform structures or those pieces of footwear in the arboreal elements. I never discover anything. It is as if that location does not exist. Perhaps that is for the best. All I comprehend is that automotive technician possessed precise knowledge of where he was directing us, and we were not the initial individuals he had dispatched down that particular thoroughfare. Of that, I am certain. Story 5. The Truck Stop Predator. The vehicular journey from Reno to Houston was intended to be uncomplicated. 30 hours of highway travel, audio podcasts, and fuel station coffee. I had previously undertaken extensive journeys for my professional role as a medical apparatus sales representative. But this particular expedition in October 2016 felt distinct from the moment I departed. Perhaps it was the marital dissolution documents resting upon my passenger seating area, or the fact that I was essentially commencing my existence anew at 34 years of age. Regardless, I had been traveling for approximately 12 hours when I pulled into this expansive truck service center just beyond the state boundary. The locale was vibrant with activity. 18-wheelers were arrayed like slumbering behemoths. Familial units were stretching their lower limbs. Truck operators were entering and exiting the convenience establishment. The neon signage for Ruby's all-night diner flickered against the darkening firmament, and my abdominal region reminded me I had consumed nothing substantial since my morning meal. Internally, the diner possessed that timeless characteristic common to all truck service centers: rubescent vinyl booths, checkered floor tiles, and the pervasive olfactory sensation of cured pork grease that likely had remained unaltered since the 1970s. I secured a booth near the window where I could maintain observation of my automobile. The server who approached possessed bleached blonde hair piled high and an identification tag that read Darlene. She could not have exceeded 22 years of age, possessing distinctive emerald ocular organs that brought to mind the color of marine flora. She accepted my order, chicken fried steak and coffee, with a genuine smile that conveyed the impression she truly found enjoyment in her profession. It was at that precise moment that I noticed the male individual seated at the counter. He was perhaps 45 years of age, clad in a faded denim outerwear over a plain white undershirt, entirely unremarkable save for the intense manner in which he was observing Darlene execute her duties. Not in a casual, appreciative manner, but tracking her movements with the precision of a feline observing an avian creature through a window. Halfway through my repast, the male individual arose and relocated to the booth situated directly behind mine. I perceived the vinyl emitting a squeaking sound as he settled in, and abruptly the nape of my neck pricked with a heightened sense of awareness. He ordered a baked dessert and a dairy beverage. I distinctly recall contemplating what an odd culinary pairing that was for an evening meal. Then he commenced conversing with me through the interspace between our booths. "Long journey ahead," he articulated. His vocalization was sufficiently pleasant, somewhat raspy, as if he had been a tobacco consumer. I offered a non-committal affirmative response and concentrated on my plate, but he persisted. He inquired as to my destination, whether I was traveling unaccompanied, what type of automobile I operated. Each inquiry felt as though he were systematically compiling information, storing it away somewhere. When I mentioned Houston, he emitted a peculiar, breathy laugh and stated, "That is a coincidence. I am proceeding in that very direction myself. Perhaps we shall encounter each other again." Darlene approached to replenish my coffee, and as she leaned over, the man's entire demeanor underwent a transformation. His reflection in the window displayed him staring at her with this blank expression, as if someone had deactivated his convivial traveler persona. She must have also perceived it because she rapidly withdrew, but not before I caught her casting a glance back at him with something akin to recognition, or perhaps apprehension. I endeavored to attract her attention when she presented my check, desiring to inquire about her well-being, but she avoided direct eye contact with me. The male individual behind me had become silent, but I could perceive his presence, breathing steadily, waiting. My meal felt heavy in my abdominal region, and although I had barely touched my coffee replenishment, I left a $20 bill on the table and rose. As I walked past his booth, he elevated his gaze towards me with these pale, ashen ocular organs and smiled. "Safe travels," he articulated, and something about the manner in which he emphasized safe caused my dermis to crawl. The parking expanse felt different when I stepped outside, obscurer somehow, even though the overhead luminaries were intensely blazing. I practically jogged to my automobile, fumbling with my keys while scanning the vicinity. Through the diner windows, I could perceive the man had returned to the counter, positioned where he could observe both the dining area and the corridor that led to the public conveniences and kitchen. Darlene was serving another patron, but she continuously glanced towards that corridor, as if she were planning an escape route. I remained seated in my automobile for a minute, engine operating, deliberating whether I should re-enter and properly forewarn her. But forewarn her about what precisely? That a patron was acting bizarrely, that he had posed travel-related inquiries to me. In the harsh, fluorescent illumination of the truck service center, my concern abruptly seemed paranoid, even ludicrous. Nevertheless, I was unable to dislodge this overwhelming certainty that something dreadful was imminent. I operated the vehicle for another 2 hours before halting at a roadside lodging establishment in Amarillo. My cognitive process replayed every minute detail of that encounter. The manner in which he had relocated to sit behind me, those calculating ashen ocular organs, how Darlene had flinched when he had gazed at her. I barely slept that night, verifying the locking mechanisms 3 times and wedging a seating apparatus under the door handle. The subsequent morning, I was partaking in the complimentary morning meal in the motel lobby when the news broadcast appeared on the wall-mounted television. The reporter was positioned in front of a recognizable edifice, Ruby's all-night diner. My plastic utensil clattered onto the table as I perceived her pronouncements. 22-year-old server discovered deceased in the employee public convenience facility. Suspected homicide. Security footage depicts a male patron following the victim. They displayed a blurred stationary image from the security camera, and even though it was grainy, I recognized the denim outerwear, the white undershirt, that predatory posture I had observed merely hours prior. The news report stated her appellation was Darlene Foster, and she had been employed at Ruby's for only 3 months, accumulating financial resources for nursing education. They discovered her corporeal remains at 11:47 p.m., less than an hour after my departure. The forensic pathologist subsequently determined she had been asphyxiated with her own apron strings in the employee public convenience facility. What rendered my entire corporeal frame numb was the temporal sequence. Security footage indicated the man following her down that rear corridor at 11:21 p.m., merely 15 minutes after I had proceeded to my automobile. Had I remained to conclude my coffee, had I lingered to leave a more generous gratuity, had I acted differently in any way, I might have been present. Perhaps I could have averted it, or perhaps I would have become another victim. The other guests at the motel were conversing about their travel arrangements. completely unaware of my internal emotional turmoil, while the reporter monotonously recited details concerning how law enforcement was seeking an individual of interest operating a dark-colored pickup truck. I contacted the tip line from my motel room, my vocalization trembling as I described every detail I recalled about the man. The detective who returned my call, a female named Judith Brennan, took my statement with a patience that somehow made everything feel more tangible. She posed detailed inquiries. Did he possess any cicatrices, epidermal markings, or unusual mannerisms? Did he specifically mention his destination? Did I observe what vehicle he was operating? I recalled perceiving a dark blue utility truck with plates from Oklahoma parked near the diner entrance, one of those extended cab models with a utility box in the cargo bed. Detective Brennan's silence on the other end indicated this information was significant. She inquired if I would be willing to collaborate with a forensic artist via video conference, and I expended the subsequent 2 hours attempting to recreate those pale, ashen ocular organs, that unremarkable countenance that had somehow emanated such menace. She expressed gratitude repeatedly, stating I had been incredibly helpful, but I was unable to cease contemplating how I had left Darlene there with him. The remainder of my journey to Houston became an indistinct blur of apprehensive mirror checks and accelerated heartbeats each time I perceived a dark pickup truck. I would find myself gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, convinced that somehow he was aware I had communicated with the constabulary. At one rest stop in eastern Oklahoma, I perceived a blue utility truck and nearly experienced a panic attack until I realized the operator was an elderly female with her grandchildren. I arrived in Houston by that evening, but I was unable to compel myself to remain in my prearranged lodging. Instead, I temporarily resided at my sister Gloria's abode, informing her I was too fatigued to be alone. I refrained from mentioning the homicide until 3 days later, when Detective Brennan contacted me with an update. They had apprehended someone, Douglas Wade Hutchinson, a long-haul truck operator with a history of assault charges in 3 states. The forensic sketch I had assisted in creating had been pivotal in identifying him. What pervades my thoughts most profoundly is not merely that evening at the diner, but what subsequently transpired. During the legal proceeding, which I attended via video link, prosecuting attorneys disclosed that Douglas had been persistently tracking Darlene for weeks. He had dined at that establishment every Thursday evening when his route brought him through, invariably requesting her section, invariably remaining until near closing time. Other servers provided testimony that they had attempted to warn her, but she had insisted she could manage him, that she required the gratuities. The night I was present was not coincidental. He had been progressively leading up to it, becoming bolder with each visit. Security footage from previous weeks depicted him following her to her automobile, standing in the parking expanse, observing her drive away, incrementally testing boundaries. The prosecuting attorney stated my presence that night might have delayed his plan. He had waited until the diner was nearly unpopulated, until Darlene was performing her closing duties alone in the rear. Had I not been present, occupying the booth behind him for that hour, he might have acted sooner. Douglas received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and I observed on my portable computer screen as they articulated the verdict. He exhibited no emotional response, merely gazed directly forward with those identical ashen ocular organs I had perceived in the diner. But what truly shattered me was when Darlene's maternal figure spoke during victim impact statements. She recounted how Darlene had contacted her every evening after professional duties to inform her of her safe arrival home. That night, she had awaited by the telephone until midnight, then commenced contacting the diner. No one responded. She operated her vehicle the 40 miles from her residence to Ruby's and discovered the law enforcement vehicles, the yellow tape, her daughter's somewhat damaged compact car still parked in the employee section. She gazed directly at the camera during her statement and articulated that whoever had submitted the information concerning Douglas had provided her with the sole solace she had found, comprehending he could not harm anyone else's daughter. I closed my portable computer and wept for 60 minutes. 7 years have now elapsed, and I still cannot consume meals at truck stop diners. I attempted once approximately a year following the legal proceeding, believing I needed to confront the apprehension. But the moment I assumed a seated posture and the server approached with her notepad, I was transported back to that booth at Ruby's, perceiving him respiring behind me, observing those ashen ocular organs tracking Darlene's movements. I departed prior to placing an order. Sometimes I search for Darlene Foster on digital platforms, examining the few photographic images that exist online. Her secondary school graduation picture, a casual snapshot from the diner's social media page where she is laughing with her co-workers. She would have been 29 years of age now, likely having completed nursing education, perhaps married with offspring. I contemplate the 37 minutes between my departure and when he followed her to that public convenience. I know, logically, that remaining would not have altered anything. He had been planning this for weeks. He would have located another opportune moment. Detective Brennan informed me that my departure might have preserved my existence, that Douglas possessed items in his truck, suggesting he had been prepared for multiple victims. But on quiescent nights when I am reposing in bed, replaying that evening, I still perceive Darlene's forced smile as she avoided my ocular gaze. I still sense the weight of that unfinished coffee. I still ponder if perhaps, just perhaps, I could have performed more.